Welcome, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, FLASHE Data, Examples and Insights from 4 Teams. My name is Stephanie, and I will be your WebEx host. Before we get started, I'd like to make a few comments for using this webinar. All lines have been muted upon entry and will remain muted for the duration of the webinar. You may submit questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A or chat panel and select all panelists or hosts from the drop-down menu. We will ask them on your behalf after each presentation and during the Q&A portion of the webinar. Should you need to view live captioning, please refer to the Media Viewer panel. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted online in the near future. And now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Laura Dwyer for a brief introduction. I'd like to turn it over to Linda Nebling for a brief introduction.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. And on behalf of the NCI FLASHE Study team, I'd like to welcome everybody to today's webinar. We hope that these examples of how individuals from outside of NCI have been using these data will continue to spur ongoing questions and utilization of this study finding. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Laura Dwyer, our project manager for FLASHE.
Good morning, everyone. As Stephanie and Linda just mentioned, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited about this webinar. I will give some brief introductory remarks on behalf of the NCI FLASHE Study team, and then we will turn it over to the bulk of the webinar, which will be presentations from the 4 FLASHE research teams. These are 4 teams that have recently published papers using the FLASHE data sets. We'll then present a brief session on frequently asked questions about FLASHE data, and then engage with webinar attendees for any questions that you have from any of the speakers or from the NCI team here. So I'll present some brief introductory remarks on behalf of Linda Nebling, April O, and the NCI team here. Briefly, the FLASHE study stands for the Family Life Activity Sun Health and Eating Study. This is a National Cancer Institute study that was conducted in 2014. It was a cross-sectional study that assessed correlates of cancer-preventive behaviors among a total of 1,945 enrolled parent-adolescent dyads. The study was dyadic in nature, and what we mean by that is that whenever possible, the parent and their adolescent child, aged 12 to 17, were asked the same survey questions, again, whenever that was possible. And data sets are available for public use and facilitate both individual analyses, so you could analyze either the parent or adolescent data, or dyadic analyses where you might be interested in asking questions about dyadic interdependence. Briefly, the dyads received, each member of the dyad received 2 surveys, one that focused on diet and one that focused on physical activity. And a subset of the participants were randomly assigned to wear an accelerometer, had the adolescent wear an accelerometer for a 1-week period. There is much more information on FLASHE than what I've just shared that's available on a couple of behavioral research program web pages. At the first link here on this screen, you can access this to find general information about FLASHE, the public use data sets available for download, the survey content, and a lot of supporting documentation that provides more information about the methodology. We also have presented a few prior webinars that provide some more detail on the study methods, recruitment, and some more specific information about the methodology. So at the second link here on this screen, if you're interested, you can access prior webinars. So one provided an introduction to dyadic data analysis using FLASHE data as an example, if that's an analytic technique that you're interested in. Another presented a background on the FLASHE study focused on enrollment, methodology, as well as the survey content. And the third webinar, which was most recently presented, focused on some of the other non-survey data resources available for FLASHE, such as neighborhood characteristics and the accelerometer data. So this figure here provides a brief overview of what is available for FLASHE data users. Again, we have, if you were to go to the first link shown on this screen, you would have access to the self-report survey data set. For both parent and adolescent, there's one focused on diet, one focused on physical activity, and also a demographic module. We also have other data sets that provide non-survey data. So we have a data set that provides information about neighborhood characteristics associated with the dyad's home and school neighborhoods, as well as a data set of derived variables from that accelerometer sub-study. And then, as I mentioned, there are several additional resources for FLASHE data users that focus on study documentation, dyadic analysis support, and we also have those 3 prior webinars for more information beyond the webinar introduction I'm providing today. Just briefly, I'll go over some of the main variables in the FLASHE data set. In the diet focus survey, which was administered to both parents and adolescents, this survey focuses on correlates of diet behavior. The primary outcomes are daily frequencies of fruits, vegetables, junk food and convenience food, fatty meats, and sugar sweetened beverages, as well as some predicted daily intake variables that are available in that data set and have already been computed for use, such as fruits, vegetables, dairy, sugars, and whole grains. In the physical activity focus survey, there are a lot of questions on correlates of physical activity behaviors among adolescents and parents. Primary outcomes in the parent survey include weekly walking, moderate, and vigorous physical activity. And in the adolescent survey, some variables have already been calculated and can be considered for use in your analyses. These are predicted in school, out of school, and weekend physical activity. The physical activity focused survey also includes some other behavioral outcome variables that were assessed with brief survey measures, including electronic device use, sun safety, tanning, tobacco use, and sleep. And each member of the dyad also completed a demographic module. In addition to demographic questions, this module includes an assessment of parenting style. There are also 2 additional FLASHE data sets available. The GeoFlashing data set is our name for the data set that focuses on neighborhood characteristics. So dyad's location is not available in the FLASHE data, but is information that was used to create variables for use that describe characteristics of the home and school neighborhood, so the adolescent school and the dyad's home location. Some of the primary variables in this data set provide descriptive information about walkability factors, commuting time, neighborhood socioeconomic status, ambient UV exposure, whether the neighborhood is urban, rural, or suburban, as well as the distance between the dyad's home and the adolescent school. There is a GeoFlashing data user's guide available on the FLASHE webpage that describes how these variables were calculated. And they were calculated for several different neighborhood shapes and sizes. So this facilitates some flexibility in deciding which neighborhood definition you would like to apply to your specific research question. And the accelerometer data set provides some derived variables from the adolescent accelerometer sub-study, and this will be available online very soon. In the last webinar that was presented in November 2018, there was more detail provided on the nature of this data set, so that's a resource that you can access if you would like to learn more information about the contents of the accelerometer data set. But briefly, it includes the proportions of each corresponding minute of the accelerometer wear period spent in sedentary behavior, light and moderate and vigorous physical activity, using various processing methods. The goals of the webinar today are to present current and prospective FLASHE data users with information on projects that have used FLASHE to answer a diverse set of research questions, as Linda mentioned at the beginning of the webinar. We'd also like to use this as an opportunity to ask FLASHE data users, so anyone who's attending today, to ask questions about FLASHE data sets and projects that may be helpful to you as you think about how you would like to use the data. And we'd like to share information in response to some frequently asked questions about FLASHE. So now I'll briefly introduce the research teams that will be presenting during the webinar today. We have a diverse set of projects represented among these teams, and we're really grateful for their willingness to present during this webinar. First, Dr. Rumei Yang, Assistant Professor at Nanjing Medical University, and Dr. Lori Linder, Associate Professor at the University of Utah College of Nursing, will present on their dyadic analysis using FLASHE data called the Effect of Screen Viewing Duration and Self-Efficacy in Limiting Screen Viewing on Loneliness in Adolescent Parent Dyads, an application of the actor-partner interdependence model. Second, Kevin Joyal-Desmarais and Alexander Rothman, both at the University of Minnesota, will present their findings on a recent FLASHE publication, again a dyadic analysis called Interpersonal Effects of Parents and Adolescents on Each Other's Health Behaviors, a dyadic extension of the theory of planned behavior. And next, we will hear from two teams who have taken interesting approaches to analyzing the adolescent data in FLASHE. First, we will hear from Xiaomeng Liu, postdoc at the Rutgers Cancer Institute of New Jersey, and Jared Stapleton, Associate Professor of Medicine, also at Rutgers Cancer Institute of New Jersey. They will present on their paper, Prevalence and Correlates of Intentional Outdoor and Indoor Tanning Among Adolescents in the United States, Findings from the FLASHE Study. And we will conclude with David Berrigan, Program Director here at NCI in the Health Behaviors Research Branch, who will present on behalf of him and Lillian Perez, Policy Researcher at Rand Corporation and former Cancer Prevention Fellow here at NCI, about their paper, School Contextual Correlates of Physical Activity Among a National Adolescent Sample. So again, thank you all for attending, and thank you so much to our speakers for presenting information about the research project.
All right, well, thank you. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we are.
All right, thank you. Well, my name is Lori Linder. I am here at the University of Utah College of Nursing, and I really am delighted to present on behalf of our recent PhD graduate, Dr. Rumei Yang, who is in China and not able to join us this morning. Okay, I thought I could, perfect. Just a moment here. So this particular project, Rumei really took the lead on this, but was to look at screen viewing among adolescents and parents. And, you know, by background, we know that screen viewing, whether it be television, computer, smartphone, or video games, is a very prevalent form of sedentary behavior. It's detrimental to sleep, interpersonal relationships, mental health, body weight, and does contribute to all-cause mortality for adolescents. And certainly from the literature, we also know that many adolescents do exceed that recommended 2 hour, or I shouldn't say recommended 2 hours, but no more than 2 hours per day of recreational screen viewing time. So what we've seen so far in the literature is that research primarily assesses the impact of screen viewing on the research that does address screen viewing primarily addresses mental health with depression and anxiety. And we do know that loneliness itself is different from depression and anxiety. We've seen evidence that loneliness predicts depression, but the reverse is not true. So we do know that parents are certainly an important influence on our adolescent screen viewing and their health. We've seen that children whose parents often have rules for screen viewing or who are role modeling healthy screen viewing habits themselves are less likely to have excessive screen viewing. And we know that parental self-efficacy is one form of parental influence that really hasn't been well studied. So the aims of this particular project were to use an actor-partner interdependence model to explore whether adolescent parent dyad screen viewing duration and self-efficacy in limiting screen viewing would be associated with their own and the partner's loneliness, and then to compare which dyadic partner exerts a greater influence on the outcome of the other than the other. So here is a picture of the conceptual framework, and just as you can see here, this actor-partner interdependence model simultaneously estimates the effects of parents and adolescents' independent variables on their own dependent variables. And then within the study context, the actor effect represented whether each dyadic member's screen viewing duration or self-efficacy in limiting screen viewing can influence their own loneliness. And then in contrast, the partner effect reflected whether one dyadic member's screen viewing duration or self-efficacy in limiting screen viewing can affect their dyadic partner's loneliness. And we hypothesized that a higher duration of screen viewing among parents and adolescents would be associated with more loneliness for themselves and their partners, whereas greater self-efficacy in limiting screen viewing would be associated with decreased loneliness both for themselves and their partners. So we did use the Fleshie data set. We've had a nice presentation of what that entails. And the measures that we used for this project related to screen viewing duration, which was measured on a Likert scale based on number of hours per day. The item that addressed self-efficacy in limiting screen viewing was this: I feel confident in my ability to limit how much time I spend using electronic devices, again measured on a Likert scale from 1 to 5. Loneliness was measured through 2 items. I feel left out and I feel isolated from others. And then we also included sociodemographic variables. So we, in our analyses, analyzed data from 1,573 adolescent parent dyads. You can see that the adolescents in our set were 14.5 years, about half female, and not quite 2/3 were white non-Hispanic. With parents, the majority were between 35 to 59 years of age, predominantly female, and then over 2/3 are identified as white non-Hispanic, and almost 3/4 reported being married, and more than 80% had at least some college. So what you're seeing here is just a report of screen viewing habits among the participants. So you can see that only 24% of our adolescents reported more than 2 hours of computer screen viewing time each day, but then the parents, just over 2/3 were reporting more than 2 hours per day. But I think, and then with parents, we also had more than half of them reporting more than 2 hours of television per day. But then as we look at our adolescents, their screen viewing habits seem to be a little more distributed across the different types of screen viewing activities, be they computer, phone, television, or their gaming devices. Let me advance here. So what you're seeing in this particular slide are the results of the actor and partner effects of self-efficacy in limiting screen viewing on loneliness for our adolescent and parent dyads. Now I've circled the actor effects in red, so that would be adolescents on themselves, parents on themselves, and then the partner effects are circled in blue, so that the adolescents effect on their parent and then the parent's effect on the adolescent. So we did see that our adolescents' self-efficacy was significantly, their perceived self-efficacy in limiting their screen viewing was significantly associated with their perceived loneliness. So that both the actor effects were significant for both adolescents and their parents, but then when we looked at the partner effects, they were significant for the adolescents, but then not for the parents. So meaning that the partner effect, the parents' own self-efficacy in limiting their screen viewing time did not have an effect on the adolescents' perceived loneliness, but that was true with the adolescents. So the adolescents' perceived self-efficacy in limiting their own screen viewing was positively, or did have a significant effect on the parents' perceived loneliness. So with the next one, we didn't see, in both cases, when we looked at actor and partner effects of screen viewing duration on loneliness, we did not see significant effects either on the actor level or the partner level. So just in discussion, we did see actor effects of self-efficacy in limiting screen viewing on loneliness for both adolescents and parents were significant. So higher levels of self-efficacy were associated with lower levels of loneliness. Actor effects of screen viewing duration on loneliness within the parent-adolescent dyads were not significant. So that's suggesting then that each dyadic member's screen viewing duration might not contribute to his or her own loneliness nor to the partner's loneliness. We did see a significant adolescent partner effect in which adolescent self-efficacy in limiting screen viewing had a greater impact on the parent's loneliness than that of the parents on the adolescent's loneliness. So this was a new finding, but the parent's partner effect, like we said, was not significant. So suggesting that parent self-efficacy in limiting the adolescent screen viewing was not associated with the adolescent's loneliness. So although adolescent self-efficacy in limiting screen viewing, although parents' self-efficacy in limiting screen viewing did not influence their adolescent's loneliness, the parents still remain an important source of support for adolescents, such as supporting their involvement in their own social activities. And then parent self-efficacy in limiting screen viewing might not be a strong influence on adolescents' loneliness. However, it still is an important internal influence on their own loneliness. And those were some of the references cited in this presentation. The larger paper has been published in the Journal of Pediatric Nursing.
Thank you, Lori. So now we will go ahead and answer some questions about this presentation from our audience. And as a reminder, you can ask a question by typing it into the Q&A or chat panel.
This is Linda Nevling. I would like to start off this discussion. Lori, what do you see as next steps in the line of research following this paper?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know Dr. Yang is getting established in her new place, but I think there's opportunity. Oh gosh. Doing some additional, potentially doing some prospective work with our, with adolescents and parents. We were to some degree limited with some of the questions that we had. It was great to have this large database, but an opportunity to do some prospective work and, potentially looking toward intervention might be some directions to go.
Thank you. because we're always looking at ways of continuing to improve the resources and the kinds of directions of projects that we support here at NCI, are there other variables that you would have liked to have included in your analysis or would have been interested to have included as we consider how to move this kind of research forward into the future?
Great. Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I brought up when I remember, about a year ago as Dr. Yang and I were working through these data. One of the challenges that I had as someone who does a fair bit of work more in the pediatric adolescent range was in being able to interpret really what year some of these kids were in school. So we really couldn't we had some limitations with the school variables. It appears that you had some variables that said non-school, whether they were in elementary school or in middle school, high school. Just knowing that some of these definitions vary from state to state and even within districts within a state, it might be helpful to just know what grade in school the adolescent was at the time that the survey was completed, and then allow us to group them if we wanted to group by, say, 6th to 8th grade, 9th to 12th grade, or whatever.
That's a terrific suggestion. Thank you for that.
All right, and now we are going to move on to our next presenter, Kevin Joyal de Marais.
Thanks, Laura, for the introduction. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to be giving a presentation on a project that looks at how the theory of planned behavior can be expanded to take into account interpersonal influences or effects between parents and adolescents in the health domain. Now, before I begin, I want to mention that there is a published version of the works I am going to be presenting, and there's a link at the bottom of this slide with where you can find the publication. There's also a link to an open access version of the same report as well, and this second link is going to stay at the bottom of this presentation. Additionally, I want to take a moment just to acknowledge our funder as well as all the collaborators that I've had who've helped with the work I'm presenting. And I'd like to also thank the team at NCI for putting together this webinar and also for creating the Fleshie dataset, without which this work would not have been possible. And so with that said, let me begin. So the work we've been doing has really started with one observation, that is that a lot of the different types of health behavior theories that exist tend to focus on intrapersonal explanations to behavior. That is, they focus on factors internal to an individual, like their cognitions, their beliefs, and their motivations. So if you take the theory of planned behavior, it looks something like this. So it states that a person's attitudes, their norms, and their perceived behavioral control will influence their intentions, and then their intentions will influence their behaviors. However, we know that interpersonal factors are also very important predictors of health outcomes. A person's relationships with others matter quite significantly. And part of this influence is thought to occur through the ways people impact each other's health behaviors. And so with this project, what we were interested in was to see if it would be possible to extend some of the traditionally intrapersonal theories to this broader interpersonal context. And so we focused on the theory of planned behavior, and this is something our team has been working on for a few years. Now, the approach we've been kind of focusing on has usually started with conceptualizing the theory of planned behavior with just one individual at a time, like shown on this slide, and then thinking what happens when you just add a second person, which has a lot of the same sort of variables occurring internally within them. And then thinking about how these two sets of variables for person A and person B intersect with one another. And one way in which you could conceptualize this is through a model which has a lot of crossover pathways like what I'm showing now, where each person's attitudes, norms, and perceived behavioral control will influence the other person's intentions, and then their intentions influence other people's behaviors. Now, there are other ways of conceiving this model, and our paper does cover that a little bit. But this is the one that this talk is going to be focusing on, and the one that we were interested in exploring with the FLASHE data set. Now, FLASHE was an ideal data set to explore this model, at least initially, for various reasons. So first, it offers responses from almost 2,000 distinct caregiver adolescent dyads. To put this into context, a lot of dyadic studies might have maybe up to 200 dyads within them. So this is a much larger study than most. It also includes assessments of variables that cover a lot of grounds in terms of the types of theories that can be mapped to, and that also are assessed across a wide variety of behavioral domains. So in our own project, we were able to identify variables that corresponded to the theory of planned behavior in order to assess, or in the domains of fruit and vegetable consumption, junk food and sugary drinks consumption, physical activity, and screen time sedentary behaviors. Lastly, the FLASHE website offers a number of different resources and documentation files, as was made clear at the beginning of this webinar. And these files contain all kinds of information that really are helpful when you're planning out research, and especially if you want to do something like pre-register your ideas. And pre-registration is something that we actually did with our own study. And so I want to take just a moment to talk about how that went for us. So essentially what we did is that we created an online document that listed all the variables, the items we were interested in, our hypotheses, and then also our analysis plan before we even access the data. This pre-registration can be accessed at the link at the top of this slide. Now this procedure we thought was very helpful in terms of organizing, clarifying our ideas before we started working with the data. It also helped us when we were writing a report to justify which results to focus on. And at least in our view, we think it helps improve the credibility of the findings that we obtain just by increasing the transparency of our process and guarding against things like p-hacking or hypothesizing after having observed some results. So to give you just a little bit more of a sense as to what that pre-registration looked like, here's an example table where we listed a construct we were interested in, so norms, and then specific items we were going to use to operationalize that construct in both parents and adolescents. We even have the specific variable names that correspond to each item in the data set, and this was information that we were able to gather before we, again, access the data thanks to all the resource files available on the FLASHE website. Then we also pre-registered a path analysis model that looked like the model on the slide right now. Now, the model we initially pre-registered did not contain an intentions construct within it, and that's because we hadn't initially identified a good item, but then we went back and modified the way that we planned to do the analysis, and then just threw in intentions into the model so that it ended up looking like this, where intentions was just a mediator before the behavioral outcome. Now, having given a sense of what the registration looked like, what did we find when we actually ran a model that looked like this? So again, here is the model we evaluated, and we were interested in all the pathways that you see in solid lines. And we evaluated this model across all the 4 domains that I mentioned previously, so fruit and vegetable consumption, junk food, sugary drinks, physical activity, and sedentary behavior. Now, just to simplify things, I'm going to break this model down in 2 parts. First, we are going to focus on what happens in the models within each individual, so within teen variables and then within parent variables, so trying to replicate traditional versions of the theory of planned behavior. And here are our results. So let me just orient you a little bit. So if you focus on the line at the very top from teen attitudes to teen intentions, what that indicates is that there's going to be a series of acronyms next to the line. each acronym stands for the domain in which that pathway was found to be a significant predictor. And then the number in the brackets is simply the average magnitude of the significant paths. So for example, teen attitudes was significantly predictive of teen intentions across all 4 behavioral domains we examined. And as you can see from this slide, if you look around, we essentially replicated each of the pathways of the theory of planned behavior in all domains we examined. There was one specific pathway out of the 32 tests that wasn't significant, but all the others were. But these specific paths weren't the ones that were the main focus of our interest. We were mostly interested in whether any crossover paths would be significant in predicting the other person's intentions and behaviors. And so here are the results of what we found when we examined those paths. I'm going to focus your attention in what is within the 2 green squares. So if you look at the square on the left side first, what we found was that there were significant effects of teen attitudes and teen norms in predicting parents' intentions to engage in behaviors such as junk food consumption and fruit and vegetable consumption, and that parent attitudes, norms, and perceived behavioral control had significant effects on their teens' intentions to engage in various behaviors. There were significant pathways across all 4 domains. Now, if you look at the square on the right side of the plot, you'll see that we found significant pathways both from teen intentions to parent behaviors, as well as from parent intentions to teen behaviors as well. And this was significant across 2 of the 4 domains. So to summarize what we found, we essentially found some evidence that classic health behavior models like the theory of planned behavior could be expanded to consider interpersonal factors, and that these factors would account for additional variance in people's behaviors and intentions. Specifically, both parents and adolescents' various characteristics predicted each other's intentions and behaviors across all 4 behavioral domains, and this was while accounting for each person's own characteristics as well. So with this observation, this leaves us with a few different questions for the future, such as whether we can design interventions to capitalize on these sorts of effects. Of course, we will need some additional studies like longitudinal studies or intervention studies to really get at how much this can be used. But it might be possible to, let's say, target teens to influence their parents' behaviors or vice versa. Additionally, can we take other traditionally intrapersonal theories and models of behaviors like social cognitive theory and the health belief model to essentially apply similar framework to what we did to the theory of planned behavior to extend them to an interpersonal context? There's still a number of untapped variables in the FLASHE data set. And so it's possible we could even use this data to answer some of these questions. And so these are the 2 main questions I'm going to leave you with at the end of this presentation. But before I wrap up and take questions, I just want to give you one last resource. So we have created a project page that is available online at the link at the upper left corner of this slide, where you can access various resources such as our pre-registration document, our analysis code files that we use to analyze the data, and there are also some links to 2 published papers that we have with the FLASHE data set. So one which corresponds to the analyses I have just presented, and then a second one which looks at how those models interact with parenting styles. And so this wraps up my presentation, and I'm free to now take a question or 2, I believe.
Go ahead. Do you want to do those first?
Yeah.
Okay.
We have a same kind of question. What do you think is next steps in your line of research following this paper?
So there are really 2 main things that I think would be especially interesting to jump into next. One would be to look at how some of these processes operate over time, a little bit like Laurie mentioned in the last presentation. The other thing that I think would be particularly insightful would be to try and obtain measures of how people are influencing each other's intentions and behaviors. So they're probably engaging in various behaviors, perhaps some persuasion strategies or trying to change explicitly the other person's behaviors, or it might be things that they're doing even just for themselves, which have spillover effects, but trying to figure out how the effects take place and transfer from one person to the other would be especially valuable.
Terrific talk, Kevin. I wonder if you could talk about other kinds of non-intrapersonal factors. I'm thinking of how social ecologists imagine the built, natural, digital, and economic environments might influence this relationship between, intentions and behavior. And how can you incorporate sort of such high-dimensional aspects of the environment into analysis like this? And are sample size adequate to use this same analytical approach?
And that's a very good point, because of course people are going to have influences from all these other domains. And sample size is always going to be a little bit of a challenge, I think. You can probably expand the degrees of sources of influence the more you kind of keep your model a little bit more contained in terms of the number of variables that you have in it. So for example, the model that we used had quite a bit of different types of variables in it, which might cause problems if then you try and add that for other levels of analysis. But if you simplify it or use kind of a simpler framework with fewer variables, I think that with a sample size like what Fleshie has, you'd be able to get some decent, at least starting estimates for how some of these broader types of networks influence people.
Sure. Thank you for a great presentation. I had a question that I thought of for anyone who is less familiar with pre-registering a study. In your experience, is it relatively easy to do, and did you have the information you needed about the Fleshie methods and background to answer any questions or fields during the pre-registration process?
Yes, good question. So registration we felt was fairly simple to do, and it involved doing a lot of things that we would naturally be doing anyways when planning out research. It's just more about being very good at documenting it and trying to figure out as much as possible before you jump into the data set. So in a way, it's more of organizing your thoughts and plans beforehand. And there's a lot of different frameworks that exist out there for how you want to pre-register analyses. So we did our registration through the Open Science framework, and they tend to be very flexible in what they demand. So you can choose essentially how much you want to pre-register. So we pre-registered things like all the items of the analyses, but sometimes it's simple enough to just pre-register the hypotheses or to create conditions such as we'll look at these things if we found this effect first, et cetera. So it's a very flexible process. And I think that the Fleshie documentation really helped flesh things out. And it is really one of the things that allowed us to be so detailed when we put ours together, that we could know what all the items were, be confident that there were corresponding items, let's say, between parents and teens. And there was also information as to where items came from and previous validation information on specific items.
Thank you so much. So now we are going to be moving over to our next presenter, Dr. Jared Stapleton.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So I'll be presenting for Dr. New, who is out of the country and unable to get access. So before I start, let me pull this up. Okay. So I talked a little bit about a paper we recently had published in Preventive Medicine Reports. And this is some work that Dr. New and I worked together to conceptualize and to carry out. I want to acknowledge my co-author, Dr. Coops, Dr. Zhu, and research assistant Vinat Parmar for their help in this. I also acknowledge NCI, who's funded several of my recent projects, and their support was important in conducting this project. So first I'll say I won't spend a lot of time on this, but we were looking at FLASHE a little differently. You know, obviously, we had some really interesting talks, Kevin and Lori, and really exploiting the nature of the analyses and some of the really interesting things you can do with that. We were very excited to see skin cancer prevention relevant variables in the data set. And so skin cancer is something that's not always on the radar as much, but it's a really big, significant public health issue. And particularly melanoma of the skin has really been rising. Sort of the only common cancers with the incidence rates that have been increasing. And so it's something that we're really concerned about, and it's not something that gets a lot of play sometimes in these larger national studies. We were very excited to see that questions related to skin cancer prevention in the FLASHE data set. And so one of the things that we're very interested in when it comes to skin cancer prevention is intentional UV exposure. And UV exposure is the primary driving factor for all types of skin cancer, including the deadly melanoma. And we know that adolescence is a time of a lot of intentional exposure. And usually when we talk about intentional exposure, we talk about indoor tanning, which are using indoor tanning beds. And we also talk about outdoor tanning or sunbathing, people laying out in the sun intentionally to get a tan. And so these are the two things that we were really excited to explore in the FLASHE data set. And one of the reasons that we're so interested in this is that we think this is what's driving some of the melanoma increases, particularly that we're seeing among young women and girls. It's sort of an unprecedented increase in this cancer over the past few decades. And we don't know a ton about. There have been some studies on indoor tanning, but not as much for outdoor tanning. So it's very much a behavior that we're still trying to get a handle on. And so we do know from some of the prior work that media use is associated with tanning, emotional status is associated with tanning. So there's some evidence to suggest that people tan for affective reasons, or there may be some addictive-like qualities of people who are excessively exposed to UV radiation. So there were some things in the FLASHE data set that we felt that we could explore. A lot of those constructs have been looked at in young adult populations. A lot of the work in this area is looking at tanning bed use among young women, young adult women. So the ability to explore these in such a rich data set with adolescents was really exciting to us. So I won't go over the paper in too detail, because I think one of the things I really wanted to focus on was some of the lessons learned and some of the things that we did with the data. But our main question was, what was the prevalence of intentional outdoor and indoor tanning among adolescents? So this data is really nice because it allows us to talk about, it's not a non-convenient sample, in a large national sample, to speak to what's going on across the country. And this data the data provides different types of data weights that you can use to make the estimates that you get more like those you would expect to see among the entire population. So it's really exciting to do it this way. And because these were sort of some questions that we felt like we didn't know a lot about outdoor and indoor tanning among adolescents, rather than using some more complex dyadic analyses, we felt like a good starting point, jumping off point, was to look at start with the prevalence and the correlates of these behaviors. So that was the first question: what's the prevalence? How many people are doing this across the country among adolescents? And then what are the associations between media use and emotional status? And I would say that the media use and emotional status, I won't go too much into those variables because they're similar, the same ones that Laura used in her prior talk, so I don't need to reiterate those. So the FLASHE data set, we talked about this, obviously, is the one we're using. I think I've covered most of this. So one of the things that I think is interesting, especially when you're looking at prevalence and correlates of certain behaviors, is to think about how you're going to use the data. I thought Kevin did an exceptional job, and his team should be commended for the type of work that they did up front to pre-register and doing all that kind of planning. And we do a lot of that too. And I think sometimes it's easy to sort of jump into these data sets and start looking at them. It's very exciting. They're big data sets with with a wide variety of people, and you start jumping in there, and you sort of forget to think about how are these data and how it's being presented. So what we really like to think about when we do this is, how, number one is how does the data look, which is the practical aspect of this, how we're going to use the data, and then sort of how are you going to present the data to tell the story or to present in the way that you feel like is most meaningful. And so when we started to look at the indoor tanning outcome, one of the things you'll notice in this frequency chart here is that most people are not tanning. And I think the vast majority were not. And then the ones who did, so that number one on the bottom of that graph represents people who that's the number one code in the survey, which is people who tan 0 times. And then number two, 1 to 2 times. So you can see from this chart, or the graph, almost everybody has responded 0 times. So, and if you look at the way that the responses are coded, those are really good ways to get people to respond in meaningful ways, and it makes sense when you're responding to these questions, because a lot of times people do tan once or twice or a few times. So it's really meaningful that way, but clearly we can't present this data as a mean or using those kind of metrics because it's not going to be distributed in the right way. It's not going to make a lot of sense. So we had to make the decision of not only based on the way the data looked, but the kind of story we wanted to tell about the prevalence of indoor tanning, how do we want to code this data? So we decided to dichotomize the variable. So people were either considered to be non-tanners if they responded 0 times on the indoor tanning, or tanners if they replied more than 1 time. And again, I think this makes a lot of sense because you can see how low the response rates are for anything above 1. So we're don't really have the power to explore, to compare 25 times or more to 11 to 24 times. So that's the kind of trade-off we have to make. And a lot of times with these larger data sets, if you're looking at a behavior like this, it's not super common. These are the kind of decisions you have to make. And there's no one right answer, but again, I think what you really do is let the data speak to you and think about the story you're going to tell with it. And then the other thing I would say too that's really interesting about this data and the indoor tanning is that there have been a lot of, and one of the reasons we were excited about this, there have been a lot of legislative efforts in various states across the country to restrict indoor tanning. And so we're always interested in we can get national level data on tanning because it's still an open question is how these tanning rates are changing based on the fact that more and more states are having more and more restrictive type policies. So this is extremely valuable data, and if we were and anytime we get this kind of data, it's helpful to tell that story because we're still trying to understand the impact of those. And the next thing we're interested in is outdoor tanning. Again, these are things like staying outside during a sunny day to try to get a tan. And again, interestingly, if you look at the way that the responses here, they make sense in terms of the way the respondents would respond to this. So never, rarely, sometimes. But again, it's not something that we could really report on the prevalence of outdoor tanning using those. With a mean or something like that because it's not meaningful in the same way as if they're reporting a number. So again, the first place we started was looking at the data, and as you can see here in this graph that shows the data, a lot of people responded 1, which was never, but there was also a lot of people who responded that they did go outdoor tanning in some capacity. So again, here we had the decision to make how we wanted to code this variable. We could code the same way we did indoor tanning, which is no outdoor tanning or any outdoor tanning, but we felt like that would be collapsing a lot of this data. People responded rarely, sometimes, often, always, because there is some variability there we didn't necessarily want to collapse across. So what we decided to do, again, there's never a right answer here, but we felt like it made more sense conceptually to use 3 categories here for outdoor tanning. So non-tanners, which are people who never outdoor tanned, non-frequent, so people who said rarely or sometimes, and then frequent outdoor tanners, so often or always. So we're trying to sort of get a sense of what these folks are like and by categorizing them in this way, and I think it makes a lot of conceptual sense. But again, it's like anytime you make these sort of cuts, it's a reviewer could criticize the decisions you make, so it's definitely an art as much as it is a science. And the other thing we were interested in sort of along the same lines of having to make decisions was media use. And so I think the questions that we had with media use, and again, I should probably have said this, it was not clear. Right now, we're just looking at the adolescent. We just use the adolescent data because we're really interested at this point in establishing the prevalence and correlates of adolescent behavior. So we didn't use the parent data at this point. And so we're interested in media use. So there are questions about how much time did you spend using computers or watching television and using your cell phone. Now, I'm not someone with a communication background. My postdoc, Xiaomeng, who worked on this study and who really led the study is. And so, we talked a lot about what this variable is and how this is, one important piece of media use. It's not everything. You could look at, there's different types that aren't necessarily represented here. This doesn't really get at exposure. So that's kind of like, when you approach a data set like FLASHE, you have to think about like what are the benefits and what are some of the restrictions. The benefits obviously are, this is a publicly available, really rich data set that, would be incredibly difficult to get on your own. But because it is a data set that gets at a lot of different constructs and concepts, you're not going to be able to get at media use in the way that if you were a comm scholar, you would design a study, and you might ask 10, 12 questions for these things. So one of the things that, in using FLASHE and other national data sets over the years, I've really learned is that you really do have to be really careful with the way you label these things and what you call them, and being upfront with, this is a valuable piece of data and it gets this, doesn't get us the whole thing, but just really being thoughtful about that, because there are reviewers at times who, may or may not appreciate the fact that, what you're gaining from quality of data, amount of data, and uniqueness of data, that comes with a bit of a trade-off with, how much control you have over what's actually there. So again, I don't think it's certainly not a limiting factor, and we don't usually have that much of a hard time dealing with it, but I just think we've learned a lot to really think about being thoughtful about how we're conceptualizing these things and what variables that we really have and how we want to talk about them. Okay, so I'll just really briefly, the paper, like I said, is published in Preventive Medicine Report, so I won't spend too much time here, but I'll tell you a little bit about, this is sort of the formula. Like I said, we've used FLASHE, we've used NHIS, we've used BRIFIS, we've used several different data sources like this in the past, and we've sort of come up on a formula of how we like to report prevalence and correlates of behavior based on these, and so I'll just quickly highlight a couple of things. So this is a table one that talks about prevalence of certain behaviors, and I know there's a lot of numbers here. But what I'll just kind of highlight a few. If you look at that top right number, that column is indoor tanning in the past 12 months. And what you'll see on the far right, top far right, is that 3% of the sample reported indoor tanning at least once in the past 12 months, which is actually good news, because this data is really supporting that in the past probably 7 to 9 years, we've been seeing a decrease across the country in indoor tanning among adolescents, which is a good thing, and I think is probably due to some potential changing of norms, but also a lot of the legislation efforts that are going on around the country in different states. And then if you go over to the left a couple of rows, a couple columns, you'll see where we have outdoor tanning. And we've broken down the percentage of the so this is these percentages represent the weighted percentage of the sample who responded to each of these subcategories. So for outdoor tanning, if you look at non-tanners, we have 42.9%. And then we have the confidence intervals around that. That's the estimated percent of the population of adolescents in the United States that is reporting non-outdoor tanning, and then another 42.2% were non-frequent, and about 14.9% were frequent tanners. And then what we often do is we break these down by these prevalence rates down by certain demographic characteristics. And so just to take it as an example, if you look at the outdoor non-tanner males, we have 52.4% who reported no outdoor tanning among males, and then 33.4% among females. And if you go over two columns, you'll see that among males, 8.6% were frequent tanners, compared to 21.2% females were frequent tanners. So clearly there seems to be a gender or a sex aspect to this, where females are more likely to go outdoor tanning than males. So this is the common way that we tend to report prevalence, and again, looking at based on demographic variables you have available. And then the other thing that we often do is we report the correlates. And again, this is utilizing whatever variables are available in a data set. And when we do this, we often do this two ways. If you look at the very first column of results, you'll see it's labeled unadjusted odds ratio. So we typically use regression analyses to compare two categories. In this case, the very first category here is non-frequent tanners compared to non-tanners. So it's looking at how age, that first number, age differs based on non-frequent tanners compared to non-tanners. And so the unadjusted odds ratio is, these are just bivariate analyses where we're looking at just the impact of age, and then the next column is adjusted. So what we typically do is we look at them individually to see if each of the factors of interest are associated with the outcome behavior. And then we put them in an adjusted model where you include all the variables together and various covariates. And what that really allows us to do is, some of these variables like watching TV or computers or cell phones, there's some collinearity there, and they're highly associated with each other when you look at them in a bivariate way. So you just look at the impact of TV on an outcome, and then computers on an outcome. By using adjusted models and putting them all into a single model, you can control that collinearity, and the ones that are really strong and are really holding up on their own tend to emerge. And so, there's a lot of numbers here. I don't want to really go over them too much, and it's hard to see in a webinar, and you can refer to the paper, obviously. But this general approach of presenting the odds ratios on adjusted and adjusted is a nice way of looking at these things. And again, it's a good way we found of presenting these correlates. And I think I'll get to there. And so again, I think just in conclusion, this really is, if you're interested in skin cancer prevention, this really is one of the most uniquely valuable data sets that are available, publicly available, and being collected this way. So, I highly encourage you to look at, there's questions about sunburn and sun protection that we did get into. There's questions about parent influences. There's a lot here that I think could make a unique contribution. So I think anyone interested in that, this is a great data source. And then, again, like we talked about before, it's just there is a lot of thought you have to put into, especially if you're going to talk about prevalence and correlates, about how you're going to present that data and what it's going to look like and the story you're going to tell. So that's something that's really important. And again, the way you talk about the variables of interest, the way you choose them, and decide to describe them in your paper is really. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So now we'd like to move into a few questions from our audience.
Thank you, Jared, for this great presentation.
Welcome.
I would like to share a question to get this, the Q&A started. What other variables related to media use or emotion do you think would be valuable to analyze or might supplement this analysis to get at factors that predict tanning? Going off a question that was asked earlier about other variables that you would have liked to include or that you think would be theoretically interesting to include, anything about media use or emotion specifically that you think would be valuable in this context?
Yeah, sure. So I think I'm not an expert in this field, so I'm kind of ripping off the top of my head with those two particular constructs. But I think for media, I think some kind of again, I realize that the beauty of these surveys is that you get a wide amount of variables. So with that, you usually don't get as much specific variables. But I think a little bit more maybe with social media or that kind of exposure, and not just how many hours, but sort of what types of things are being viewed. I'm very interested in body image theory, and we know particularly with indoor tanning and some of these things that a lot of what's happening is that women, it's not just about what's being viewed, but it's sort of how it impacts them internally. And so there are things that we measure about sort of internalization of certain norms that are perpetuated by media. So the classic example is weight norms and ideal norms that women get. So constructs like that maybe personally as someone interested in body image, but to get sort of the effect of, it's not exactly quantifying the type and amount of media, but how it's impacting them on a sort of cognitive level would be interesting. And I think the other aspect of that with the emotional aspect, I think we know that a lot of behaviors like tanning seem to have some mood component, so maybe some sort of mood constructs, or something to do with emotional regulation, those kind of things. I think we get a little bit more general aspects that kind of get a sense of what people's general mood is, and those things may be motivating these type of behaviors. I think would be relevant for all of the different kinds of constructs.
Jared, great talk. I wonder if I could ask you if you think that there's geographic variation in indoor tanning, and if that acts more as a main effect or if it might interact with some of the intrapersonal characteristics associated with tanning?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm actually working on a grant to kind of explore some of that, so I hope other people think it's a great question too. But yeah, I think so. I think it's both a little bit. I think you know, being here in New Jersey, it's been really interesting. I've been here about 9 years, and you know, coming as an outsider, you know, we're seeing the beach culture, right, and how that works, and just sort of the norms of people growing up near the shore and what that means, you know, compared to other parts of the country is really interesting. So, you know, there's some certainly effects of culture, but I think the culture also interacts with sort of the regulatory environment of the state, which is something that we've seen a lot in the past few years with different states passing different laws. There are no federal restrictions that are banning adolescents from using tanning, but what we're seeing is more and more states have laws. They either ban adolescents from using at certain ages, or they have to have parental consent and that kind of thing. So certainly I think, and there's some data that's coming out that suggests that those are working in adolescents, you know, tanning rates are going down in the states that have more strict restrictions. So I definitely think it is both. It's main effects of that, and then I think, you know, that interacts with, in terms of like the, you know, the cultural, the cultural environment is something that I think we need to explore more. But there's certainly some data. There's not a ton, but what's out there suggests there's something going on there.
All right, thank you so much. Now I'd like to move over to our final presentation, and I will pass over to Dr. David Berrigan.
Okay, thanks so much, and thanks everyone online for sticking with this session. Last but not least, I hope. Can people hear me, or do we need to verify that, or are you confident? Okay. So I'm delighted to share some of this work that was led by Lillian Perez, as was mentioned earlier. She's just moved out to Rand in Santa Monica, so presumably she won't need indoor tanning there. And I may also allude to some work by another fellow here, Calvin Tribby, so just channeling their hard work. Next slide. So this talk is about physical activity in adolescence, and we're addressing this topic because of the short-term benefits of physical activity, improved bone health, fitness, interaction with obesity. But then for NCI, some of the long-term effects of adolescent activity are especially important. Physical activity tracks into adulthood. Lack of physical activity is a known risk factor for cancer at multiple sites. And physical activity during adolescence in young women can reduce risk of breast cancer. So this has both general public health implications and specific implications for the cancer mission. The major public health problem here is the dramatic decline in physical activity that's observed in U.S. And to some extent in European adolescents. These are data based on accelerometry in an analysis by another former NCI fellow, Brittany Belcher, where you can see that from 6 to 11, where accelerometry data suggests, you know, perhaps 40 or 50% of the kids are adhering to recommendations, a dramatic plunge in that number down to less than 10% in the 12 to 19-year-olds. Next one. Additionally, in both Europe and the U.S., high school students report less school-time physical activity and less active transport to and from school. Most adolescents do not adhere to IOM guidelines on achieving at least half of recommended PA during school hours, and these numbers are, you know, tiny. 8% of achieving the recommendations of PA in school, or 25% achieving the recommended levels in middle school. So I think there's a serious public health challenge here, and we need some more research to try to identify new targets for interventions at the individual or policy levels. So we take an ecological approach to this problem. Can you scroll through to bring up the other elements? Yeah, thanks. That's all of them. Where, you know, a lot of the past research has focused on these individual and psychosocial determinants of physical activity, but despite a lot of attention, it's less well understood what the policy and environmental influences on physical activity might be. Excellent. And scan through, yeah. So we operationalize this sort of socio-ecological perspective with a model illustrated here to try to address how do policy and school environmental factors explain physical activity among middle and high school adolescents. So at the individual level, we have our psychosocial and socio-demographic correlates that might influence active transport to and from school and school time physical activity, which add up to overall physical activity. In the school environment element of the socio-ecological model, we took a look at some neighborhood factors related to the built environment and SES index. And then at the policy environment, we linked these FLASHE data to information from CLASS, a resource that catalogs physical activity and PE-related state laws. So we're trying to look at multiple levels of influence on these physical activity behavior. The study, we used FLASHE data as appropriate for this webinar, and I won't say too much about FLASHE since we've heard that several times, but our analytical sample was 978 public school adolescents. So in this study, we're not taking advantage of the dyadic nature of the FLASHE study, but examining the kids on their own. These multi-level studies, sometimes you spend almost your entire presentation describing all the different variables. So for physical activity, we use the Youth Activity Profile Questionnaire and the modeled estimates of minutes per week of school-related MVPA and total MVPA. These methods are described by St. Maurice in AJPM and in R. Lillian's paper that appeared in Preventive Medicine Reports earlier this year. So you can check out some of those details. For the policy layer of our modeling, as I mentioned, we used the CLASS data set and looked at the physical activity related state policy classifications per specs. And this respondents received scores based on the state laws in their state of residence. One variable was whether there was a physical education time requirement. We scored those policies as weak versus strong, and whether there was a physical activity time requirement directly as opposed to PE instruction, and we scored that as none versus any. The variables describing school environments involved 4 variables, 3 related to the built environment that were calculated using a factor analysis on tract level variables and resulted in variables that we call density. Higher scores represented higher density. Neighborhood age, higher scores represented older and presumably more walkable neighborhoods. And commute time, higher scores represent higher percentages of residents with short commutes to work. And then the neighborhood SES was characterized with the Yoast SES index, a composite variable that uses a number of census indicators of SES. So Lillian addressed how are policy and school environmental factors associated with PA among middle and high school students using logistic and linear regression to examine these associations of school environmental factors and state laws. We ran separate models for middle and high school youth. The models used survey weights from FLASHE and were adjusted for school, urban, rural location, socio-demographic variables, and several psychosocial factors specific to physical activity in our view. The dominant factor influencing active transport to school is distance. So you can see here a table of odds ratios adjusted for middle and high school students with categories home to school distance, the reference less than 1 mile, 1 to 2 miles, 2 to 3 miles, greater than 3 miles. And so you can see living greater than 1 mile away from school is associated with much, much lower odds of active transportation to school. So we adjusted for this variable in our future analyses, but in the analyses I'm going to show you, but I think with possibly a larger sample size or in retrospect, it might have been interesting to do some stratified analyses, just looking at characteristics of the kids that lived less than a mile from school. So what did we find? We found significant positive associations between state laws only for high school respondents. So that's what I'm showing you here. I'm not showing you the middle school results. And what you can see are positive associations between the presence of a physical education time requirement and positive associations between any physical activity time requirement versus none, and self-reported school time PA, both cases. And then for estimated school-related moderate physical activity, we only saw an association with any PA time requirement. However, there was no difference in the estimated total MVPA associations, suggesting there might be compensation here, a little more physical activity in school, but perhaps less physical activity elsewhere, leading to no change in the overall association. In terms of the school environment, we had one statistically significant result where those attending schools in neighborhoods where local residents had short commutes to work were significantly less likely to walk or bike to school than those in school neighborhoods with longer commutes. We're still puzzling about this result. It's hard to understand without mapping the actual places that people live and thinking in more detail about the relationship between homes, schools, and transportation options. One possibility is that parents with shorter commutes might have a greater probability of dropping their kids off in kind of a trip chaining. But again, I think we need more granular data about environments to really understand this issue, and we talk about that in our paper. Before we jump to some conclusions, there's some strengths and limitations of this analysis. I think the range of variables that FLASHE offers across levels of influence, including policy, school environment levels through linkage, and the individual characteristics is a big strength of this study. And for subtle questions involving psychosocial and environmental variables, this is a large sample from across the U.S. So those are key strengths. Limitations, it's a cross-sectional study. There's a focus on one type of transportation behavior, whereas adolescents might well use mixed modes of transportation, mixing up automobiles, cars, skateboards, bicycles, et cetera. We do have a limited set of neighborhood variables, and the built natural and economic environments is a high dimensional aspect of people's context. And there's always this fear you didn't capture the right ones. There's potential unmeasured confounding by district or school level policies or practices. We only link to state level policies. Next slide. I also wanted to take a minute to mention Calvin Tribby's work using FLASHE. This work, we've submitted a paper about it. And it's a little, sorry, this slide is a little hard to see, but Calvin noticed that FLASHE had variables related to whether you were homeschooled, public school, or private school student. I saw that in Jared's tables earlier. And he was interested in that and took a look at physical activity by school type. And he noticed statistically significant differences in the amount of physical education. Sure enough, the homeschooled kids did not have PE classes, and this resulted in less physical activity in those students. So the reason I wanted to show you this is FLASHE has, a pretty high-dimensional matrix of different possible variables to analyze. And I think you should encourage your students and your colleagues to use these big surveys to think, creatively about hitherto unexplored elements of how context might influence behavior. And so this is a small sample size. There's only 131 of these homeschooled students. But Calvin went on to analyze another survey, the National Household Transportation Survey, that just happened to have a homeschooling variable. with a much larger sample size, but much worse questions about physical activity, and he gets similar results. So I think sometimes triangulation from different surveys is a way to take advantage of the distribution of strengths and weaknesses of different data sources. So I commend that approach to you. Next slide. So the way I wanted to conclude is not to reiterate the results of this, but to talk about some of the challenges Lillian and Calvin and I and others here at NCI have been talking about with analyzing the FLASHE data. First of all, several of the talks today mentioned the weights that allow you to weight up the survey to give you sort of nationally representative estimates. I think whether or not you want to use those weights is a subtle question that depends on the kind of research question you're asking. Are you trying to generalize across the country? Are you trying to answer a specific kind of question about associations between psychological and behavioral variables? Exactly what you're using your analysis for can influence the choice of whether the weights seem appropriate for your work. Representativeness is a challenge. This adolescent sample was pretty highly active compared to other national samples, and most of the parents were highly educated. So we might want to think about, the consequences of that for inference from the FLASHE analyses. I mentioned earlier the appropriate geographic context issue. Class data or policy data is from the state level, but local policies for schools could well matter. And I think any kind of analysis of FLASHE data has to think about what spatial units you can use if you're trying to pay attention to context. The walkability, the environmental measures related to the built environment were estimated at the national level following a protocol developed by an earlier investigator, Hayner et al. And in the Hayner study, we estimated walkability indices from these census variables for the state of Texas, whereas in this study, we did a factor analysis of the same variables at the national level. And when you do that, you get somewhat different factor loadings. And so when you're doing analyses at different spatial scales, you need to think about how's that going to influence some of these environmental indices. And I think we need to do a little more work on that scale issue. And I'm trying to convince some cancer prevention fellows to do that. But anyone on the call is welcome to that research target as well. There's a limited set of environmental variables, as I mentioned, and that's a challenge. And the fact that we can't share addresses is this perennial privacy concern for survey data analysis. And going forward, we've been talking about that privacy limitation for decades, and we still haven't figured out how to make accessible, HIPAA-compliant, remote analysis possibilities that are economical to implement and allow this analysis. So this is just a very difficult problem in this area. And that limitation leads to a limited ability to account for spatial clustering, which can be an important influence on the results of statistical analyses of spatial data. So, next one. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And we will now turn it over to anybody who has any questions on this presentation or any other presentations that we've seen already today. As a reminder, you can ask a question by submitting it either in the Q&A or the chat box and selecting all panelists or hosts.
I have a question for David. David, you mentioned that the GeoFlashing data do include a limited set of neighborhood variables. The FLASHE surveys also include a brief set of perceived neighborhood environment variables, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts or suggestions for FLASHE data users who are interested in getting into analyses and incorporating the neighborhood environment about decisions about using perceived versus objective neighborhood variables, whether you'd recommend including them in the same analyses, anything like that.
Great question. And so Lillian had another year of funding here at NCI, but she decided to double her salary and take a new job instead. But my hope in her third year as a fellow was that she would analyze precisely the interaction between measured characteristics of the environment and perceptions of the environment. So there's a small literature concerning walking that suggests both perceptions and measured features of the built environment have independent associations with the behavior. So clearly that's a logical next step. I can't recall off the top of my head what the perceptions questions were in FLASHE and whether all the adolescents filled them out as well. But I think that's the next big step in this research on physical activity in the built environment, is getting a better handle on those interactive effects and thinking about how to modify both perceptions as well as actual environments.
Thank you.
Oh, the class data I mentioned, and you can read about this in Lillian's paper, and then a whole series of papers that Frank Perna is always one of the authors of. But the class data is housed.
It's on the NCI Health Behaviors Research Branch website. So if you search class Health Behaviors Research Branch NCI, you should be able to find a web page for that. It also provides a wide range of data resources, data tables. It will generate data maps based on state or region, and is another public use data set that is available for use in a wide variety of analytical projects.
And includes some information about diet as well as physical activity. So
correct. The URL is class.cancer.gov. Are there other questions for any of our speakers from the presentations today?
I actually have a question for the other speakers that I've been wondering about, and maybe this is more for the psychologists speakers. FLASHE addresses the adolescent and one parent, but I think many of the families in FLASHE, there are two parents. Does that matter, or talk about that a little? And I don't know whether any of the presenters want to do it, or Laura might want to comment on that, or April.
I'd be fine commenting on or taking that question.
Super.
So, of course, I think it's actually very important to start thinking about additional family members, including the second parent, because there might not be only influences coming from the second parent, but the way in which parents interact with each other might also be impacting the children. And in terms of other family members, there's going to be siblings that matter. Sometimes it might be influences between the partners themselves. So while some of our past works have actually been between or in the domain of romantic partners, and we have found that there are cross influences there. And so with the FLASHE data, we were interested not only in how the parents were influencing the child, but the child influencing the parent. And if you're thinking of the parents, then they might also be receiving that sort of influence from their partner. And of course, then you have the siblings, and you might have other people involved in each individual's networks that are going to have additional influences like their friends. And some of our kind of thinking in this space is that it probably matters which domain of behavior you are considering, that for some domains, some relationships are going to matter more. So for example, thinking about what people are eating at the dinner table might be something that's more within kind of the family, whereas some types of physical activity behaviors might interact more with people that are outside the family.
Absolutely, yeah, those seem like really good points and grist for future study designs.
I think we've handled most of our questions from the online and asked our panelists. So let me go back to our speakers. Are there any final thoughts or recommendations or challenges that you would like to put out there for this group, this community, in terms of moving this area of science forward?
I'd just like to chime in that I think Fleshie is an amazing resource and feel lucky that I got to do some work with my postdocs using it, and I think there's a lot more work to be done with the data set because there's, as I mentioned, a high-dimensional data set filled with interesting tidbits that can be used to inspire hypotheses for future studies, longitudinal designs, and thinking about the interactive influences of dyads on behavior. So thanks, Fleshie team.
Yeah, and I'd also say as someone who is interested in sun protection, doesn't necessarily have the time to do this right now. I think that it's really hard to get good parent data, and there's so much we don't know about why adolescents use sun protection. There's sort of contextual factors, and there's the influence of the parents and availability and all kinds of things. But to be able to understand more about how parents' attitudes and thought and decisions about these kind of things impact their kids' sun protection is an area we really need work in. And it would be there's a lot of great data available at the click of your fingertips. So I would highly encourage anyone interested in that area to explore.
Yeah, and kind of building on the idea of understanding the influence process and that's how that occurs, one of the things that I'd like to reiterate is probably the importance of thinking about how time plays into this, how things develop over time, and capturing how the processes work out as well. So when a parent develops a certain mindset that may then be influencing their child's sun exposure behavior or their eating behaviors, how does that occur?
Wonderful. So now I'd like to move over to our FAQ portion of the webinar. So I will pass that over to Laura.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all of the speakers for those great presentations. Really shared a lot of interesting findings and research approaches with using Fleshie. We'd like to conclude the webinar with a few brief slides that focus on Fleshie FAQs. So often the project management team for Fleshie receives questions in either through email or during these webinars, and sometimes frequently asked questions do come up. So the reason we wanted to share this information is we hope that it will be helpful in providing you with a little bit more information that you might consider including in your papers or in responses to reviewers if you get questions about Fleshie or in your conference presentations so as you move forward with your work. One, probably the most commonly asked question we received is, where can I learn about Fleshie projects? So this email address listed in the first bullet point is where you can contact the NCI Fleshie team with questions you have about Fleshie, and we'll respond to you as soon as we're able to. You can also request at any time through that email address a PDF of a Fleshie publication list, which we update regularly. Or you can also email us if you would like to share information with us about your Fleshie publications or presentations. That's not required. We don't require you to provide us with updates on how you're using the data. But if you'd like to give us a heads up that you have a publication coming and would like it added to the publication list, you are welcome to do so. A current list of Fleshie publications will also soon be available online, I think in the upcoming week or two, and we plan to update that quarterly. So we will keep that up to date so you can access that and get a list of where you might want to reference other publications or read more about Fleshie and informing your ideas. A current list of FLASHE publications are also attached to this slide set. I will not, go through all of them, but it's more for your reference if you're accessing the archived version of this webinar and would like to see a current publication list right now. As of the last time this list was updated, there were 40 FLASHE-related publications, as well as several theses and dissertations that have used FLASHE and presentation as well. The publications to date range quite a bit in terms of content and purpose. So there are several methodology papers that might be helpful to you if you're interested in learning more or referencing a paper about the FLASHE recruitment methods accelerometer sub-study, for example. And the analytic papers to date really have focused on a diverse set of approaches and outcome behaviors, as well as other psychological and other variables as outcomes. So there are analyses representing adolescent outcomes, parent outcomes, as well as dyadic correspondence. And multiple behaviors, as you've seen in these four presentations as well, are represented in the existing publication list. Another question we receive quite a bit is about whether the FLASHE measures are validated. So on the FLASHE website, there is a list of the sources of various FLASHE items and scales. So you can access, I think it's called the item source and reference list. So if you have a question about whether or where a specific item or set of items came from, you can access that document to receive that information. In brief, FLASHE measures were drawn or modified from existing validated measures. And there were some pre-testing procedures that were done before the launch of the full study. These included cognitive and usability testing, which I'll get into a little bit more on the next slide, but not further analysis of measures validity beyond the validity information in the existing literature. That said, the FLASHE project management team did use a set of criteria to guide the selection of measures that were included in the final survey, and that's what you see here in this table. I won't go through them all to be brief, but this is just to point out that there were a variety of criteria kept in mind when devising the final survey, and you are welcome to use this information to respond to any questions you might receive about FLASHE. So some things I just want to highlight. Length of measures has been brought up today as a, strength of FLASHE in the sense that there are short measures that allowed for a breadth of constructs to be assessed, but also a limitation in that brief measures were sort of necessary in order to accomplish the goals of the study, which had a fairly broad scope. Because the study included adolescents, it was really important that the items were relevant to the target group, which in this study included both adults as well as adolescents, using unbiased language and more clear and unambiguous, appropriate reading level. Also relevant to the construct validity could be administered practically given that this was a web survey, for example, and also that there was not conceptual overlap across the measures for efficiency in the survey. Related to that question, sometimes we are asked about the cognitive and usability testing and what those pre-testing procedures entailed. So the cognitive testing, the goal of that procedure was to pre-test items, specifically those that maybe had not been previously tested or used with an adolescent population. And the goal of cognitive testing was to identify issues with understanding or responding to the items. The sample in the cognitive testing procedure that consisted of 20 parent adolescent dyads, diverse in race, age, and socioeconomic status, who all completed cognitive interviews while completing the FLASHE survey items. And from cognitive testing, the team learned a lot about any issues or concerns, or where there weren't any issues or concerns with responding to items. And that really informed revisions that focused on wording changes, modifications that might be necessary from the original measures for an adolescent sample, or changes that were needed in instructions to clarify things for the intended sample. Usability testing was done later after cognitive testing and was done pretty shortly before the study launched. The goal of usability testing was to pre-test the online version of the survey, specifically with adolescents. So usability testing focused less on the question content and understanding, because that was the focus of cognitive testing, and more on navigation of the web format. So to identify issues with survey instructions, navigation, the web design, make sure that, in particular, the adolescents could fill it out and could understand how to do so. This was done with 9 adolescents, diverse in race, age, parent, education, and screen time. And revisions from usability testing results focused on things like revising and deleting navigation buttons throughout the survey screens to make it easier to complete. Another question, why are some raw variables not available in the data sets? David Berrigan got at this question with mentioning that the location data are not available, and this is something to think about in the future. That's suppressed in the data set, but was used to derive the variables in GeoFlashing. And other variables we're sometimes asked about are variables that were recoded in some way. So these are variables like household income, which in the final data set is dichotomized as less than or greater than 100,000 per year. Type of parent cancer diagnosis, which was recoded and collapsed in the data set to just no cancer history, history of one cancer or history of multiple cancers. Parent age is another example where it was recoded to categorical in the final data set. The reason for these recodes, when you do see them throughout the survey or explained in the Fleshie methods report, is that sometimes recoding or suppressing a variable from the data files was needed because of results from a risk assessment analysis on identifiability. So as with most data sets, we needed to protect against the identifying the respondents and the dyads in the data. And something unique to Fleshie that we also needed to consider is we needed to protect the one respondent's data from being, identified from their corresponding dyad number. So the consent forms for Fleshie, for example, said that the adolescent data would not be shared with the parent and vice versa. So in addition to protecting identity from, being determined from the public, we also needed to take that dyadic factor into consideration as well. So WESTAT ran a risk assessment analysis specifically on the demographic variables, which could have an identifiability risk, and crossed the demographic variables with each other to examine cell sizes, and based on that analysis where there was sparseness in responding, that drove decisions about recoding for this data set. And another question we get sometimes is, we get questions in about whether data users need to analyze diet, physical activity, or other Fleshie variables in a specific way. So we get this question related mostly to the 2 primary outcomes, diet and physical activity, but also sometimes in relation to variables like parenting style. The Fleshie team does not require that variables are analyzed in a specific way, so data users are completely able to decide the best way to compute and treat the variables for their research questions. That being said, there are some variables in the diet and physical activity surveys that have been computed and are available for you to consider to use. So in the diet surveys for both parent and adolescent, there are daily frequency variables, so providing the number of times a day that a certain group of foods was consumed. These variables are useful to consider, particularly for junk foods as assessed in Fleshie, which do not share a common unit of measure. And then there are predicted daily intake variables consistent with algorithms that were applied to the 2009-2010 NHANES dietary screener. Also, with the adolescent physical activity data, I won't get into the details of this, but there are manuscripts and other webinars that have been presented for FLASHE that talk about this in more detail. But based on the responses to the youth activity profile and the accelerometer substudy, those two data sources were used in conjunction with each other to create predicted variables that are predicted minutes of physical activity occurring at school, out of school, and on the weekend, as well as out of school sedentary time. So in brief, data from the YAP youth activity profile were calibrated with data from the FLASHE motion study. As was mentioned in an earlier talk, just one thing to note is that the physical activity values in FLASHE are relatively high. And there is a commentary that Greg Welk and colleagues wrote and is published in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine that talks about that and talks about any recommendations for data users interpreting these values of physical activity. And parenting style distance is asked about quite a bit. And I think that's probably because it was on the demographic module. So the item reference list for the diet and physical activity survey do not include parenting style. Just wanted to clarify where those items came from. They were drawn from the parenting style inventory and include items that assess responsiveness, demandingness, and autonomy granting. Parenting style items are often used to create typologies of parenting, and I think in the documentation for the original scale that's described. But again, no requirement to use the variables in a certain way. And just one note I wanted to include here that for some of these dimensions, I think particularly for responsiveness, the values in FLASHE are not normally distributed. So there's some skewed distributions. Just to be mindful of, as was mentioned for some of the tanning variables and some of the other variables in FLASHE. And I think those were all of the frequently asked questions. Hope that was helpful, but you're also welcome to reach out to the FLASHE team with any other questions you may have. These next few slides just are that current publication list that I mentioned in case you are accessing the webinar sites later on and wanted to see a publication list as of today.
All right. It doesn't look like we have any other questions coming in. So we will go ahead and end the presentation and give you a few more minutes back in your day. But thank you again for everyone for joining us. As I mentioned earlier, the presentation will be posted online in the near future. But in the meantime, we invite you to stay connected with us by visiting our website, which is up on the screen now, also our Twitter page, and subscribing to our email updates. So thank you, everybody, again, and I hope you have a wonderful day.